They say blood is thicker than water. But what happens when that blood is poisoned by a crown? Alpha King Rocco had it all, but he discarded his one true mate, Rosalind Briar, calling her barren as the stones he ruled. He exiled her to the snow to die, choosing a scheming, politically powerful queen named Valeriana. 6 years later, he is celebrating the birth of his new heir. He sends Rosalind an invitation to the Pup Ceremony, a final cruel act to mock the barren mate he threw away. But he made one fatal mistake. He didn't know. She was already pregnant when she was exiled, and she isn't coming back alone. But in this story, the reunion isn't a fairy tale. It is a funeral. Hey there, story lovers. Before we dive into this royal mess, my granny, who swears she was a werewolf in a past life, says if I get to 1,000 subscribers this week, she'll finally tell me which neighbor she barked at in 1985. So do it for Granny. Smash that like button, hit subscribe, and tell me in the comments, are you listening from the comfort of your bed or sneaking this in at work? Let's get into the story. The envelope was rough, gray parchment that smelled of crushed granite and freezing rain, the scent of the Stone Kingdom. It felt heavier than it looked in Rosalind's hand, a cold weight from a past she had buried in the deep snows of the sanctuary 6 years ago. It wasn't addressed to Ms. Briar, the healer of the woods. It wasn't even addressed to the name she used among the elves. It was addressed to the barren weed. Her fingers tightened against the paper until her knuckles turned the color of bone. Even without opening it, she knew who it was from. Only one man possessed cruelty sharp enough to cut across territories just to leave a scar. Mama? Rosalind's rigid posture melted instantly. She dropped the letter onto the moss-covered table as if it were contaminated and turned. Reed, her eldest by mere seconds, stood in the doorway of the wooden cabin, rubbing sleep from his eyes. At 6 years old, he was already sturdy and grounded, with messy brown hair and a jawline that was a miniature echo of the king's. "I'm here, my sapling," she murmured, brushing the hair back from his forehead. "Go back to sleep. The sun isn't up yet." "Ash is talking in his sleep again," Reed mumbled, but his gaze drifted past the gray envelope on the table. "What is that?" "Nothing, Reed. Just kindling for the fire." He didn't look convinced. His eyes, those earthy, observant eyes, narrowed. The unmistakable, piercing gaze of the alpha line. "It smells cold," he said, his nose twitching. "It smells like iron. It smells like the man in the stories." Rosalind's blood ran cold. Her sons had never met Rocco. She had never even spoken his name aloud. But the blood knew. The ancient magic that bound them recognized its source. Or perhaps something else was calling to him, a whisper from the spies she didn't know were watching. She tucked Reed back into the room he shared with his 2 identical brothers, Ash and Moss, ensuring their chests were rising and falling under the quilts embroidered with sprouting vines, and returned to the kitchen. Her hand trembled as she broke the slate-gray wax seal embossed with the unyielding rock of Rocco's kingdom. "You are hereby commanded by royal decree to attend the naming ceremony of His Royal Highness, the true heir, born of Alpha King Rocco and Queen Valeriana. Your presence is requested to bear witness to the strength of a fertile line, a blessing the great wolf grants only to the worthy." It was a command, a summons, but the scrawl at the bottom, carved deep into the paper with Rocco's heavy hand, was the true weapon. "Come and see what a garden looks like when the weeds are pulled, Rosalind. See the son a real queen gave me, and mourn your empty womb." She sank onto a wooden bench, the memory slamming into her with the force of a landslide, as fresh and raw as the day it happened. 6 years ago. The throne room of granite. She was 20, hopeful, wearing white. And Rocco had looked at her not with love, but with the cold indifference of a boulder crushing a flower. She fastened her white cloak in her mind, thinking it was armor against his insults. She didn't know she was dressing for her own funeral. How could Mother not see the darkness growing in her own children's eyes? Rosalind stared at the parchment, the cruel words swimming before her eyes. Mourn your empty womb. The phantom laughter of the court echoed in her ears, dragging her back to the day the world ended. The throne room of granite had been freezing, stripping the warmth from her bones. She remembered kneeling on the unforgiving gray slate, looking up at Alpha King Rocco. He hadn't been angry. He had been bored. "Look at you," he had sneered, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings as he looked down from his high seat. Soft, weak, barren as a stone. He had gestured to the guards as if she were refused to be swept away. "Get her out of my sight. I need a queen who can bleed for this kingdom, not a wither flower." The memory burned, searing through the peace she had built in the sanctuary, but it also ignited something fierce and molten in her chest. She wasn't that trembling girl anymore. She stood up, crumpling the letter in her fist until her nails bit into her palms. She didn't need to mourn. She had a garden that had flourished in the wild, defying every curse he had spat at her. "Boys," she called out, her voice steady. 3 identical heads popped up from the bedroom. Reed, Ash, and Moss tumbled into the main room, their energy filling the small cabin. They were the image of health, sturdy and grounded, their messy brown hair tousled from sleep. Rosalind moved with purpose, pulling out their ceremonial clothes. She dressed them in matching vests of deep forest green velvet. On the chest of each, she had painstakingly embroidered a symbol in silver thread, a single sprouting seed breaking through a crack in a rock. It was her sigil, her silent scream, her answer to Rocco's insults. "Where are we going, Mama?" Moss asked, standing still as she buttoned his collar. "To a party," Rosalind lied smoothly, smoothing the fabric over his heart. "To show the world what grows in the snow." The boys exchanged glances. They didn't ask about the father she never mentioned. They simply nodded, their expressions strangely solemn for children of 6. As Rosalind turned to pack her own trunk, reaching for the white gown that looked like fresh snowfall, she missed a quick, furtive movement behind her. Ash, the quietest of the 3, reached under his pillow. He pulled out a small, heavy object, a pin shaped like a jagged granite crown. It wasn't something a child of the forest should have. It certainly wasn't something Rosalind had given him. With a glance at his mother's back, Ash slipped the cold metal into his pocket, his small fingers closing over the secret that would soon bleed them all dry. Sylvan Hawthorne stood beneath the canopy of ancient weeping pines, his figure blending seamlessly with the winter landscape. His coat, a heavy wool dyed the deep, verdant green of the deep forest, hung loosely over his frame, and his hair, shimmering like the silver bark of an aging birch tree, caught the pale morning light. He looked less like a wolf and more like a spirit of the woods, an elven-wolf hybrid tasked with guarding things too fragile for this world. As Rosalind emerged from the cabin, her white cloak billowing around her like fresh powder, Sylvan did not return her smile. His pale eyes fixed instantly on the 3 boys marching behind her. "You should not go, Rosalind," Sylvan said, his voice rustling like dry leaves. "The stone does not forgive, and it does not forget." Rosalind paused, adjusting the glove on her hand. "I am not asking for forgiveness, Sylvan. I am demanding acknowledgement. They deserve to know their birthright." Sylvan stepped closer, his gaze intense as he scrutinized Reed, Ash, and Moss. The triplets stood in a row, their faces impassive masks that seemed too old for their years. Sylvan inhaled deeply, searching for the scent of the wild, of the pine and earth that had raised them. But beneath the fresh scent of soap and winter air, there was something else. A faint, cloying sweetness. A decay. A rot. It felt like a blight hiding in the roots of a healthy tree. "There's a shadow on them," Sylvan warned, his hand reaching out to intercept her. "I feel a sickness in her aura." a distortion. They are not grounded, Rosalind. They feel untethered. Rosalind laughed, a brittle sound that cracked in the cold air. She placed a hand on his chest, gently pushing him back. You worry too much, old friend. It is just nerves. They are about to meet a king. They are terrified, just as I am, but the bond is strong. I feel it humming in my veins. My sons are with me. She turned away, blinded by her own righteousness, her absolute faith in the blood she had nurtured. She ushered the boys toward the waiting carriage, missing the glance Sylvan shot toward the trio. As the boys climbed up, Sylvan saw Ash lean into Reed's ear. Their lips moved, forming sharp, guttural syllables that did not belong to the melodic tongue of the forest. It was a clipped, harsh dialect of the stone court, a language they had never been taught. Sylvan's heart hammered a warning against his ribs, a scream to stop the horses, to bar the path. But he looked at Rosalind's determined back and swallowed his fear, a silence that would cost them everything. The wheels of the carriage jolted, signaling the end of the soft, moss-covered paths of the sanctuary and the beginning of the unforgiving royal road. The transition was violent and absolute. Within miles, the towering pines and vibrant undergrowth vanished, replaced by a desolate expanse of jagged slate and withered scrub brush. The air grew thinner, biting at their skin with teeth of ice, carrying a metallic tang of ore and unwashed stone. It was a land stripped of mercy, a perfect reflection of the Alpha King who ruled it. Inside the carriage, the silence was suffocating. Rosalind sat opposite her sons, her heart squeezing with a mixture of maternal protectiveness and a creeping, undefined dread. She had expected them to be restless, perhaps asking questions about the father they were about to meet or the court they had never seen. Instead, Reed, Ash, and Moss sat in a rigid row, their hands folded in their laps with military precision. They stared out the window at the gray wasteland, their expressions unreadable, their stillness unnatural for boys who usually chase squirrels through the underbrush. "It looks frightening, I know," Rosalind said softly, leaning forward to offer comfort. "But remember, you are strong. You are the forest that cracks the stone." She reached out, seeking the warm, small hand of her eldest, Reed. She needed the tactile reassurance of the bond, the spark of love to settle her own trembling nerves. But before her fingers could graze his skin, Reed jerked his hand away. He didn't look at her. He kept his gaze fixed on the passing gray cliffs, his jaw set in a hard line. "I do not need to be held," Reed stated, his voice devoid of the childish warmth she cherished. "I am not a pup." Rosalind recoiled, stung. She pulled her hand back into the folds of her white cloak, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Of course," she whispered, telling herself it was just the stress of the journey, the pressure of the impending confrontation. They were growing up, hardening themselves against the world. She couldn't blame them for mimicking the landscape. Up front, Sylvan hunched in his green coat, shivering not from the cold, but from the oppressive energy radiating from the carriage behind him. The closer they got to the heart of Rocco's territory, the heavier the air became. Then the fortress appeared. The citadel of granite loomed against the darkening sky, a monstrosity of black rock and sharp spires that looked less like a castle and more like a spear thrust into the heavens. It was a place designed to intimidate, to crush hope. Rosalind took a sharp breath, preparing to soothe her terrified children. But when she looked at the triplets, the breath died in her throat. They weren't cowering. They were leaning forward, pressing their faces against the glass. Their eyes, reflecting the jagged silhouette of the fortress, didn't hold a shred of fear. They looked ravenous. They looked like wolves who had finally caught the scent of blood and were eager to feast. What were they expecting to find behind those walls that made them look at a prison as if it were a playground? Rocco sat paralyzed, the wine dripping from the dais like a fresh wound. His eyes, usually hard and unyielding, darted frantically between the boys. He traced the lines of their jaws, the set of their shoulders, the fierce amber burn of their eyes, his eyes. He looked at the sprouting seed embroidered in silver on their green vests, a sigil that screamed life in the face of his accusations. The irony was a physical blow. The woman he had exiled for emptiness had produced a triple bounty of strength, while his queen sat beside him with nothing but poison and politics. A collective gasp swept through the onlookers. Lords and ladies whispered behind their hands, pointing at the undeniable resemblance. "The nose," one whispered. "The brow," said another. "They are the king in miniature." The lie of Rosalind's barrenness crumbled instantly, dissolving like mist in the morning sun. Rosalind felt a surge of vindication, hot and righteous. She placed a gentle hand on Reed's shoulder, expecting the warmth of her son, the boy she had sung to sleep under the forest canopy. "Go on," she encouraged softly, her heart swelling with a tragic pride. "Step forward, my sons. Introduce yourselves to the man who said you could never exist." The triplets moved as one, stepping out of her reach. They didn't look at the crowd. They didn't look at Sylvan, who stood tense and white-knuckled by the door. They walked until they stood directly beneath the king's boots. They looked up at Rocco, their expressions wiped clean of the childish wonder Rosalind had expected. Rosalind held her breath, waiting for Reed to speak the words they had practiced, or perhaps to define a low "Father" that would cement their claim. She waited for them to demand their birthright. But Reed didn't look at Rocco. Slowly, deliberately, his gaze slid past the king to the woman sitting in the shadows of the throne. He locked eyes with Queen Valeriana, whose lips curled into a razor-thin smile. Reed didn't scream, and he didn't cry. He simply gave the queen a slight, chilling nod, a signal of a pact sealed long before Rosalind ever opened that invitation. The silence in the great hall stretched thin, a tightly wound string ready to snap. Rosalind watched Reed, her breath caught in her throat, her heart beating a rhythm of triumphant anticipation. She expected him to demand his name. She expected him to embrace the heritage she had fought to preserve. Reed turned his gaze from the queen back to Rocco. His small face, usually so open and honest, twisted into a mask of rehearsed terror. He took a stumbling step forward, his hands reaching out not in greeting, but in a plea for salvation. "Save us, Father," Reed cried out, his voice pitching high and trembling. "Please. This woman, she stole us." The world tilted on its axis. Rosalind staggered back as if struck physically. "Reed," she whispered, the name falling from her lips like shattered glass. "What are you saying?" "She lied." Ash shouted, stepping up beside his brother. His eyes, usually soft with the wisdom of the woods, were now hard and accusatory. He pointed a finger at Rosalind, the very finger she had bandaged 100 times. "She kept us hidden in the dark woods. She told us you were dead. She told us the king was a monster who would eat us. She is a traitor." Moss screamed, his voice joining the chorus of betrayal. "She took us from our cribs. She isn't our mother. She's a witch." The accusations hit Rosalind like arrows, each one finding a mark in her chest. The room began to spin. The white dress she wore, once a symbol of her purity and truth, now felt like a shroud suffocating her. "No!" she gasped, looking frantically between their faces. "My loves, look at me. It's Mama. Who told you this? Who poisoned you?" "Lies!" Reed sobbed, throwing himself toward the dais. He didn't run to Rosalind. He ran to the feet of the king. "Don't let her take us back to the cold. We want to be home." Sylvan Hawthorne roared, a sound of pure, feral rage. "They are enchanted," he bellowed, reaching for his blade. "Rocco, look at them. This is the queen's doing." But before the protector could take a single step, a dozen spears slammed into him. The heavy shafts of the stone guards drove him to his knees, pinning him to the gray floor. He struggled, his silver hair matting with blood, his eyes locking onto Rosalind in helpless apology. Rosalind stood alone in the center of the hall, stripped of her protector, stripped of her dignity, and now stripped of her motherhood. She looked at the boys huddled near Rocco's boots, the boys she had starved to feed, the boys she had frozen to keep warm. Boys, she wept, taking a trembling step forward, her hand outstretched to cup a cheek, to fix a collar, to do anything to break the spell. The sound of mother's heart breaking is silent, but echoes louder than any scream. Rosalind reached for them, but as her fingers brushed the air near Reed, he didn't lean in. He flinched violently, shrinking away from her touch as if she were a monster reaching out of the dark. Queen Valeriana descended from the dais like a spill of poisoned wine, her crimson skirts rustling softly over the stone steps. She moved with the predatory grace of a viper, striking at a mouse. Reaching the huddle of weeping children, she sank to her knees, pulling Reed, Ash, and Moss into her embrace. The boys, who had flinched from their own mother's touch only seconds before, melted into the Queen's arms as if seeking shelter from a storm. "Oh, you poor lost princes," Valeriana cooed, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet sympathy that echoed to the silent hall. She stroked Ash's hair, her eyes locking onto Rosalind with a gleam of pure, triumphant malice. "How terrified you must have been. How cruel she was to keep you from your true home." Rosalind's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The sight of Valeriana's bejeweled hands on her son's felt like a physical violation, a desecration of everything she held holy. She watched Reed bury his face in the Queen's neck, inhaling the scent of the woman who had ordered their kidnapping, accepting the lie as truth. Above them, Alpha King Rocco stood. He did not look at the sobbing reunion with warmth. He looked at it with calculation. He saw his lineage secured. He saw 3 strong heirs who hated his enemy. The narrative was perfect. The truth was irrelevant. "The law of the stone is absolute," Rocco thundered, his voice vibrating through the floorboards. He stepped down from the obsidian throne, his shadow stretching long and dark over Rosalind. "You stole the royal blood. You hid the heirs of the crown in the dirt, denying them their birthright and their father. I saved them." Rosalind screamed, finding her voice at last. She fell to her knees, not in submission, but in desperation to be on eye level with her children. "Reed, look at me. Remember the songs? Remember the treehouse we built? I am your mama. This is a lie. Treason," Rocco declared, cutting through her pleas. "Kidnapping. The punishment for stealing from the crown is death." Rosalind ignored him. She crawled forward, reaching out a shaking hand toward Moss, the youngest, the one who always cried when it rained. "Moss, please. Look at me." Moss turned his head. His eyes, usually a warm, melted amber, were now flat and dull. They were hard, unyielding, and utterly empty. He looked at the woman who had birthed him, who had nursed him, and he saw nothing but a stranger. There was no recognition. There was only the cold, dead stone of the castle reflected in his gaze. Rocco reached to his hip. The scrape of steel against leather hissed through the hall, a sound of finality. The blade was massive, a headsman's sword forged from the darkest or the mountains. He stepped between Rosalind and the boys, severing her view of them with his body. He didn't look at Rosalind as a mate he had once claimed to love, or even as a person. He looked at her as a weed that had choked his walkway, a nuisance to be cut so his garden could finally grow. Sylvan thrashed against the iron grip of the guards, his face a mask of bloody ruin. He howled Rosalind's name, a sound of raw grief that should have shattered the stained glass windows, but the citadel absorbed it like it absorbed all light. He was forced to his knees, his head yanked up by a fist in his silver hair, compelled to witness the extinction of the light he had sworn to protect. 2 guards kicked Rosalind's legs out from under her. She hit the floor hard, the impact jarring her teeth, but she felt no pain. Her world had narrowed to 3 small faces peering out from behind the queen's crimson skirts. She didn't plead with Rocco. She didn't curse the heavens. She simply locked eyes with Reed, Ash, and Moss. Tears carved hot tracks through the dust on her cheeks, falling onto the cold granite that would be her deathbed. "I love you," she whispered, her voice a fragile prayer in the suffocating silence. "My saplings, I love you." The boys did not blink. They did not cry. They watched her with the detached curiosity of statues, their connection to her severed by a blade sharper than steel. Rocco grunted, the heavy muscles of his back bunching as he raised the black iron sword high above his head. The blade caught the torchlight, a flash of darkness before the end. There was a sharp intake of breath from the court, the whistle of air, and then the sickening thud of finality. The white dress turned crimson in a single heartbeat. You watched. You listened. You saw an innocent mother betrayed by her own blood. If you can scroll away without subscribing after witnessing such tragedy, then perhaps your heart is as hard as King Rocco's. Don't be a silent witness. Subscribe and help us tell her story. Silence returned to the hall, heavier and colder than before. It was done. Rocco lowered the dripping sword, panting slightly, his eyes gleaming with a twisted satisfaction. He extended a hand toward the boys. "Come," he commanded his new heirs. "Take your place." And they obeyed. Reed, Ash, and Moss stepped forward. They didn't walk around the body of the woman who had birthed them. They stepped over her. They trampled the white silk now pooled in red, their small boots leaving prints of blood on the stone. The hem of Reed's green vest brushed against the wet floor, and the silver embroidery of the sprouting seed, Rosalind's symbol of hope, was instantly stained a deep, violent red. They took their places beside the killer, standing tall and proud, 3 miniature copies of the tyrant. As Rocco placed a heavy, claiming hand on Ash's shoulder, the youngest, Moss, looked up. For a fleeting second, the amber fire in his eyes vanished. A strange, controlled violet light pulsed in his irises, the color of dark magic, of a puppet master pulling strings. High above them, Queen Valeriana saw it, and her smile widened into something predatory. The boys weren't just lied to, they were possessed, and the king had no idea what kind of monster he had just let into his house.